Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild adventure The Heir of Orcus Verse 2, designed by Anthony Joyce for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, please consider supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Shout out to my platinum patrons Andrew, Brian, Richard, and Joe, and gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, and Pretty Boy and Yuma. Thank you all so much for your support. Hopefully you have already looked at my review for The Heir of Orcus Verse 1, because The Heir of Orcus Verse 2 is literally a continuation of that adventure. It is not so much a sequel as it is a part 2 of 2. One of my only complaints about Verse 1 was that it was kind of incomplete. It didn't really finish, and it really just feels like these two are one adventure that was just awkwardly broken up about 2/3 of the way through, which also means this one feels maybe a little shorter, a lot shorter than it should for what is a complete package on the DM's Guild. So with that being said, and if you're unaware, please look at my Heir of Orcus Verse 1. But it uses that same pixelated art style, which I really love, even though I recognize that it is kind of very played out, especially if you played any indie games lately. But it's really well done here. It has the same awesome art assets, the same cool isometric, like literally 8-bit style maps, tokens, like just a staggering amount of handouts and art content, especially for virtual tabletops. Which is always a big plus for me as someone who primarily plays D&D on Roll20. That's all really, really cool. It's really just a single dungeon, which is, again, that whole Verse 1, they're just trying to get to this Temple of Orcus. And this one is just the Temple of Orcus. And honestly, I was pretty disappointed with how short that temple is. Again, this is sold as a complete, as a standalone package on the DM's Guild. So if you're going to do that, you really need some content there. And I like all the extra visual aid content, and everything on Roll20 is really cool that Anthony put together with music and all that. But it really is just a very, very short, pretty linear dungeon. So let's take a look at the Heir of Orcus Verse 2. A comic's also very, very cool. And again, it picks up right where Verse 1 left off. So in Verse 1, you have either sided with the Holy Knights, or the Knights of Holy Judgment, Sir Titus and Sir Gertz, or the Cult of Zariel, which has the Succubus-Incubus twins. And you've chosen to either go on this good path or this evil path. Again, the video game influence is very, very strong with this one. So you've got, I guess, this party of NPCs with you, which makes your party much stronger than what it would normally be. And the first one ended with literally you at the entrance of this temple. So this one is just that temple. And it consists of only really 3 rooms. And it's just a straight up path. It's not so much as, it is a temple rather than a full-on dungeon. Now, it's filled with monsters. So if you felt like the combat was a little low, although that's kind of something I praised in Verse 1, just because I thought it was a lot of fun social interaction, lots of good exploration. And again, the whole thing would work much better if Verse 1 and 2 were combined into one adventure, because then you've got a lot of your social interaction and your exploration in Verse 1 with the manor belonging to the tieflings, and then a lot of your combat would be in the climax. So that the whole thing does flow when it's put together like that. But if I'm just reviewing Verse 2, because again, Verse 2 is sold as a separate product on the DM's Guild, it's very, very combat heavy. Every room just has a shit ton of monsters in it, although they're all very appropriately themed, demons and undead, and it does use some pretty cool monsters in some interesting and appropriate ways. The entrance, which I don't think this actually has a map embedded, so I have to go to the end. I'll also switch to the Roll20 map at some point. So here's what the actual dungeon looks like. And again, it's got that really, really cool pixelated art style that you would find in a lot of these 8-bit games, or in a lot of these indie games. Shout out to Zeboyd Games, who makes games like Cosmic Star Heroine. Those are all very, very cool looking, and kind of has this similar style, like Cthulhu Saves the World and all those, not to go off on too much of a rant. I like these games a lot, so I like this style. and it's done very well. But you can see it's not very big, and it's as linear as you can be. You just walk in a straight line from bottom to top. That's all you get. Now there are some cool things in here. So obviously the bridge over lava. There's plenty of fun opportunity there, and this place is just crawling with demons. There's some flying shadows around. There's a very funny cameo from a certain video game character with a ghoul wearing that character's armor, which is pretty funny. I'll probably reveal that reference later on, but see if you can get the... it's wearing like green space armor and a very imposing, obviously like a space marine type helmet, but it's a ghoul, so obviously they died, and it's just from another plane of existence. So that's a funny Easter egg. I'll get into that later, but it's just a whole bunch of monsters out here. It's pretty straightforward, and then they make it inside, and there's a whole nother more monsters, demons, these things called Rudderkins, which are from, I believe, Mordenkainen's Tomb of Foes, which is cool to see that, which, and again, I'm skipping kind of below so we can see the map, but the appendices here is fantastic, especially for how short and brief this adventure is. It has every single monster stat block in here. It doesn't just say, hey, look them up here in the monster manual, look it up here in Mordenkainen's. It actually includes everything here at the end, which is very, very nice to have, especially because I wasn't quite sure of where some of these monsters were from, like the Rudderkin and the spawn of Caius are, I believe the spawn is from Volos and Rudderkin is from Mordenkainen. So we're starting to get now to some expanded monster supplemental material that DM's Guild can draw upon, but it is very, very nice and helpful to have that included here as an included stat block. And those monsters are all just roaming around here. There's a giant vat of black ooze that, of course, does bad things. Intrepid players could maybe lead the monsters over here and then attack the ooze or do something to spill it, obviously, so that's kind of an interesting hazard. These bowls of blood and ichor can be drank. I don't know who the fuck is going to walk by and drink a bowl of blood, but it does heal you and then it ages you. And the idea here is that Orcus wants his followers to die. It seems like a really just bad plan to follow Orcus. Just wants to replace everybody with undead. I guess unless you're going for like the lichdom thing, but it seems like most undead you kind of lose your sentience, so kind of a bad deal. There's an altar over here that you can sacrifice a living creature to, and you grow like bone wings for 5 hours, which is kind of crazy. And again, the weird thing is you can actually take an evil path. So maybe you killed the knights and you sided with the demon twins. So I guess if for some reason you had an allied NPC with you that you wanted to sacrifice, I don't know, that seems weird. Like, nobody's sacrificing a PC. That's not cool. So it's cool that there's, I guess, a rule here, but I don't see this altar really being utilized. There are skulls. I think it's either skulls in the walls or these flame... Oh, and the flame pillars. There's pillars you can put in there that explode. So another trap. And then there's skulls that have their own D100 table with kind of wild magic style effects. Where the hell is that table? Here we go. Skull effects. So there's these skulls in this... oh, here it is in the inner temple area. All these little skulls floating here. And literally, it's basically like wild magic. You roll a D100 percentile dice, and that determines what kind of thing happens. This is wildly unbalanced. Some of them are just goofy, like create an illusion, spit green pus at a character, or it just wails loudly or flies around. Other ones are just absolutely catastrophic, like it casts polymorph on the PC, it teleports them to another plane of the DM's choosing with no like set duration on that. It summons a monster up to CR4. So it's pretty crazy how different that can be. And I get that wild magic is kind of the same thing. I feel like, I don't know, maybe players would want to just roll the dice and have fun with it once they realize they can touch these skulls and have different crazy things happen. As a DM, I would probably look at some of those and be like, all right, which ones of these are actually the most interesting, and maybe roll with that. But you know, it's partly what I saw in the manor, which is that every room has cool stuff in it. It's not just like you enter a room, there's one, you know, description here, moving on. So yes, it's a short linear dungeon, but there's a lot of neat stuff packed into these areas, which I do appreciate a lot, which almost makes it feel like a dungeon that's twice as big that might be just filled with kind of empty or nearly empty rooms. So it doesn't have the quantity, but it does have the quality. And then when they get to the actual inner temple here, the actual boss... So the goal is to... I probably should have mentioned this earlier. The goal is to rescue this fallen angel. And again, if you went through verse 1, then you know that that's your goal. You're looking for this this angel that was probably defeated in this temple trying to seal away this evil. And of course, it's that classic struggle of she did actually seal the evil, but she was basically killed in the process, transformed into that spawn of Caius, which has these worms. It's like it's like a powerful zombie, but it has worms that can shoot out, burrow into other people, and then those worms just do constant damage until that person dies and becomes a spawn of Caius. There doesn't seem to be a way to actually get rid of the worm once it burrows in. So if your players are not in the up and up on like, it just takes an action to scrape that thing off. It seems like they will eventually die and turn into a worm monster, which seems pretty awful, but that's something that I would probably telegraph to the players. Is like, you want to get these worms off. They're bad news. The trick here, and the kind of fun part, is that the Heir of Orcus, the titular Heir of Orcus, is a Cambion, which is a demon spawn, basically. It looks like kind of a succubus, incubus style demon, who is currently chained up to this altar, and she's chained up with these magical shackles that she can't get out of and can't use her plane shift for, because that's what the fallen angel did to her. So the fallen angel was killed, but she was able to chain this demon spawn up. Now the cool thing is that Cambion has an ability to cast Alter Self, and she does so whenever the players enter this area, and then she's like, oh, please rescue me, and which I love, because that is wonderfully thematic and appropriate in a demon-themed dungeon, and for a Cambion to do is to immediately take on the role of Sir Vindicus. So she has altered herself to look like that angel, be like, oh, please free me. Now, granted, most players, I would think, are not going to rush up there and immediately do it. Maybe somebody's role-playing kind of a simpleton, which would be funny if they ran up and tried to immediately free her. But I think most players would be very cautious and would probably try to suss out the fact that this is actually a demon in disguise. It is triggered that if the players do figure it out, then that triggers the spawn of Caius Hierdo, I believe, to kind of burst through the sarcophagus and attack. So there is a boss fight no matter what, and technically the Cambion could still, I think, fight from being chained up. She mainly has that fiendish charm ability that she could use to charm one of the PCs into helping her. But I do like that for a climactic end boss fight. I think that's pretty neat. My only problem is that if the PCs are following the adventure from verse 1, then that means they've got a huge party of allies with them. They've either got a knight and a priest, if they took the good path and kept them alive, or it even says the knight and the priest, if they died, then they come back as sword wraith warriors and still join the party, assuming the party took the good path. If they took the evil path, then they have the incubus and the succubus with them, as well as, I believe, an imp if the gnome dies in verse 1, which he most likely would. So, and the adventure doesn't really explain, like, well, if they died and you're against them, so you killed the succubus and incubus, and it just says they can come back and rejoin the adventure. Well, at what point do they actually come back? There's no notes on, like, well, here's a good time for these other creatures, because that would make for a good, more balanced situation. So, for example, if you're following the good path and they didn't die and you've got them and you killed the demons, then the demons could reform and come back during that final battle. Maybe they come back and say, oh, you opened the path for us or some bullshit, and then they manage to help free, or maybe they can't free her because they can't also touch those shackles because they're evil, but at least they provide another boss fight, and that spawn of Caius pops out. But I was looking for some way for these, because that's a good note in verse 1, the fact that these NPCs, you know, there were notes on, like, what happens if they die and then which path they chose. There were a lot of really good detailed notes on that. So I was hoping to see that again here, and instead it's just kind of a reminder of what happened in verse 1, but there weren't any specific notes about here's a good place to use, like the demon twins, whenever they come back, you want to put them in this spot specifically. They just never get mentioned again, which is bit of a bummer. But otherwise, that's really all this has. I mean, if you don't include the appendices, the whole thing is like 6 or 7 pages. So it's a lot shorter than verse 1, and verse 1 was already pretty short because it felt like just 2/3 of an adventure, and this one just feels like the last third of the adventure. So again, I just don't like the way that these were broken up into episodes. Excuse me. You can do that. I'm repeating myself from verse 1. You can break things up into episodes if you want, but they need to all feel like their own complete little story arcs. They need to feel like their own, episodes of a TV series that have a beginning, middle, and end, and then it can continue with the next, episode. You can't literally just stop. It just feels like the episode was stopped like halfway through, and then it picks back up with, okay, here they are. Now they're in the dungeon. That part is a bummer. Now, the odd thing is, you could take verse 2 and put it in as a one-shot anywhere, and it actually fits a little easier than verse 1 because this is basically just a dungeon. So you could just slap that Temple of Orcus down anywhere you wanted to if you want to just use that, and then obviously replace some of the NPCs or however you want to with any kind of demon-themed very mini temple dungeon, which would work just fine, I think. So you get the awesome pixel art in the portrait. So, and the problem is because I've already seen all this stuff in verse 1, I'm slightly less impressed by it in verse 2, which isn't quite fair. It's still really, all the art and stuff is really, really good. But I was wondering, like, okay, well, if this is broken up, then that means verse 2 must be really big and worthy of having its own entry, and it's not. It's really not. In fact, it's really short for having its own separate episode in there. I still really like the content. I love the way it divides up the pillars between the three, although it's kind of stretching when it comes to some of these exploration and social checks. It's basically just combat the whole way. The organization is fantastic. You can adjust the encounters. Like, everything that I want from a DM's Guild adventure is basically here, but it just feels incomplete the way verse 1 felt incomplete. Combined with verse 1, so these two together, is a fantastic Tier 1 adventure if you particularly like that 8-bit pixel style, and obviously you want to run a demon-themed campaign with very clear good and evil lines being drawn. In that case, I could definitely recommend this. Taken on its own, however, it's a trickier one to recommend just because the quality is there. I just don't. There needed to be more quantity for the fact that this is a standalone. Just looking at verse 2, this is a standalone dungeon. And again, there's no notes on like what happens if you don't take the verse 1 plot hooks or anything like that. There's nothing on, here's some random plot hooks or how to replace things. It's just like, no, this is meant to be played after verse 1, but you have to purchase verse 1 separately, which is a little disappointing. The one funny bit I want to look at, the magic. This is so seemingly random, and it just kind of points to the fact that the designer just really wanted to include it. Is this random ghoul who's wearing this space armor, which is very clearly from Doom. It's the Doom guy armor with the dread helm and the green breastplate space armor, and it has the number 12/10/1993 written inside the breastplate. And the reason I said it like that is because, and I looked it up because this rang a bit of a bell for me, is that the original Doom was released December 10th, 1993. Fun little fact there. So, Anthony, I totally picked out your fun little Easter egg there. It's a very random Easter. I mean, well, Doom obviously is about killing demons, so like that part does fit in there pretty well. So that's funny. I accept that. The whole like different plane of. I mean, I don't. It's stretching the line of what you can do with an Easter egg is including this kind of space armor thing. Thankfully, it's not. It actually fits into D&D. It's just this helmet. I think lets your eyes glow red and gives you like a readout of your of your like body system, like the Doom games. And the breastplate is just green, I think, and has those like numbers and says doomed on it. So they're just flavored magical items, which I think is a cool thing to have. I really do like rewarding Tier 1 adventures with fun items. They shouldn't be a lot of game-breaking items at that level, but I think just giving people really fun, flavorful items that they can roleplay with makes it really, really fun. I want to switch over before I start my pros and cons to the Roll20. Here we go. Module here, just because Anthony included this, was kind enough to show me the Roll20 module all put together, and it is very, very impressive. And I mentioned this in verse 1. It looks absolutely fantastic. All the 8-bit art looks great. He's actually got all even the macros all set up. You can see the dynamic lighting and everything. Like, it looks really, really good here, and obviously this is a good look at the map in general. I'm not sure why it goes all the way to the sides like this, because there's no real point to it. I would probably just erase that, move the enemies up here, and cut this off. There doesn't seem to be. I mean, my players, if they see this gap and see enemies coming through, they're going to want to explore those sides, and there's just nothing. But it looks really, really good. And you can see there's the not really Ser Vindictus on here. This is the Cambion in disguise, which, you know, I think these are appropriately fun enemies to use here, and they're used in fun ways. But I would definitely have the NPCs reappear during this final climax, and at least tie up your NPCs so that it's just the party versus the Cambion / versus the spawn of Kairos. And that might actually be too much. I don't know. It really depends on how low the party is before they've entered. And I mean, it looks like they would be able to short rest before going to this inner sanctum. So I mean, I like the design of this dungeon. It looks good. I was just expecting it to be bigger and have more stuff in it based on the fact that this was separated into its own product on the DM's Guild. I was betting, oh, okay, we're entering this dungeon, and then it's like to be continued. Well, shit, this is going to be a big deal. And it's still, you know, it's nice. It's got the good art style, and all that stuff is good. The actual stuff in these rooms are good, but I was just expecting more from the dungeon itself. And if it hadn't been separated, I don't think I would have had that same disappointment level. I would have been like, okay, this continues that same greatness. This all looks really good. Had it been all one adventure, I can't stress that enough, how much that would have really, really worked out for the best. But as it is, I do think it makes for a good ending. It's just painful that you have to get both of them. Hopefully there is a bundle deal down the road, because I think that would be the appropriate way to handle this adventure. So quick pros and cons. I guess I need to switch back for that window there. I'm going to go ahead and leave it on this portrait handout screen, because I do really, really love these handout designs here. My quick pros and cons are honestly pretty similar to verse 1 for the most part. You know, you got the pro, unique pixelated art style. Looks absolutely fantastic with the maps, the handouts, all that. That's the other pros. The maps are provided. There's only the one map here, unlike verse 1, ironically, which had more maps, and then this one is the actual dungeon map. Each scene has the 3-pillar breakdown between combat, exploration, and social, although it's a little less interesting here because it's basically just combat the whole time. As is written, there was one interesting note about how the players could dress themselves, like pretend to be zombies and roll a performance check to try to get through the first area, which I think is really, really interesting, that I as a DM would not have thought of, and I don't think any players would think of. I think they just see that area and think, okay, well, it's combat time, baby. So that's kind of a funny note and an interesting one. So I do still like that, and I do want to see that going forward, that fun breakdown between the pillars of combat, exploration, and social. Pro, there's an excellent use of monsters in this one. There's not a lot of monsters. Well, I mean, there is for how short this dungeon is, but the Rudderkins, which is a neat monster from Mordenkainen's, the spawn of Kairos, and the Cambion at the end. Just a really cool way of using these monsters in a very appropriate thematic ways. And then pro, there's an exhaustive appendix here that includes all NPCs and monster stat blocks, which is very, very helpful to have, especially when monsters come from all these different sources. Cons, you know them. The temple, very short and linear. It's only literally 6 to 7 pages. It's 3 rooms. I think it's broken up into 4 rooms here. There's a lot going on in each room still, which is great, and there's a lot of monsters and everything. The quality is still there. I was just expecting more quantity, again, because this is separate. And then cons, this really should have been combined with verse 1 to create one complete adventure package, and then I think it would have worked really well. As it stands, verse 2 is disappointingly short and linear for the fact that it was separated. Final verdict: while its dungeon is disappointingly short, the Heir of Orcus verse 2 continues the detailed designs and excellent pixel art, making for a satisfying adventure. A satisfying ending to the adventure. Thank you for everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. You can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.